Hi guys. As you all know that I've already taken a lecture on the concept of time, and I've also shared a couple of articles on the concept of space and place. Now I'm hoping that these three concepts are quite clear to you all, and you will see that these three concepts are crucial in understanding this lecture on historical geography. Anyhow, it's a generally accepted idea that historians are interested in time, while space is the purview of geography. As such, history is sort of built around this notion that it seeks to trace changes in the passing of time. Time then is considered, an entire process is considered to be a process of linear progress. And here the idea of time is that of linearity. As I mentioned to you all in the lecture on time, that there are various other forms of, or rather, various other understandings of time depending on certain cultures. However, here we are taking time as a linearity. And all of this sort of process of linear progress happens within a space, which in turn is then never questioned. In such a scenario, uh, space is a given, it's a constant, it's a background against which all the historical events sort of unfold. Now, since the work of Einstein, uh, it is apparent that time and space are not constant, though it should be mentioned that these things are only manifested under extreme conditions that too at the subatomic level, and as such have no bearings on the historical processes. However, in the last century, there have been many geographers as well as sociologists who have continuously sort of worked on this concept, uh, and space has come to be recognized as this dynamic sort of dimension of historical change, and far from just being a background, sort of a canvas, physical space, and the ways in which it is sort of represented has contributed immensely to the ways in which historical actors have behaved. Here one thinks of, or one is reminded of the works of people like Fernand Braudel and Eric Wolff, who have shown that geography matters because the physical landscape sort of sets the limits to the movement of people, and these limits sort of have a profound bearing upon what is possible, or rather what is thought to be possible in this realm of spatial imagination. Um, if you take this argument further, then it's also true that the people sort of are defined, and they define others by the way in which space is represented and experienced. Uh, and it should be remembered that uh, the manner in which space is represented and experienced is inherently political, and there are always struggles in defining the nature of particular spaces, and those who are able to define an order and perhaps represent space are the ones who tend to prevail in these struggles, whether it's at the micro level, micro level such as locality, the city, or even as something as limited as the household, or that of the macro level, such as the nation or the global. I mean, as an example can be given of the European imperial endeavor, which, if understood, then can be seen as an appropriation of space. Uh, and also, if Edward Said is to be believed, its representation. Defining a space, especially as wild, untamed, or even a wasteland, is often a prelude to its annexation, especially by the colonizing forces in the 19th, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, to a certain extent, 20th century. Uh, Now, the prelude to colonization is often the argument given of democracy. However, that is a whole different argument. As far as the case of defining a space as wild, untamed, and a wasteland is concerned, an example can be given of India's northeast frontiers. How that space through the late 18th and early 19th century was continuously described as being both wild and untamed, and how that led to its colonization. Of course, it's a much more complicated process for which we have sort of no time here to discuss. Uh, Now, uh, if we come back to the concept of space and place, then it could be said that space and place, they tend to orient researchers in general, and historians in particular, in dimensions other than time. As I mentioned before, time was one of the dimensions in which historical changes, and most researchers tend to trace the variation. Space and place are other dimensions in which the same thing can be done. Uh, Historical geography, or even cultural geography, helps us understand how spaces and places change. A perfect example can be given that of a novel by H.G. Wells, uh, The Time Machine, which came out, I think, in the late 19th century, 1895, I think. And the protagonist, was only known as the time traveler, sort of shifts forward in time without ever moving a muscle. His vantage point remains the same, which is, just simply sitting in the machine, as he either goes forward in time or retreats back in time, and how he sees the place or the space change all around him. Deriving from this example, one could say, at its simplest, historical geography sort of charts changes in a single place, looking for things like altering power relations and how it's manifested through iconography or changes in the landscape, etc., or examining cultural, social, political relations, especially in comparison to other places. In short, historical geographers are interested in places and spaces and what they represent over time. Um, you know, the thing is, a study of a place can tell us quite a lot. Take the example of the Bank Junction, at the heart of London's financial district. The city has iconically and, in reality, been the heart of the British Imperial powerhouse. It has provided the money for expansion, and it's where most of global trade was conducted. And one should remember that the business did not just take place, in the abstract concepts of insurances and loans, but it was actually seen and experienced in actual space. And this particular space has attracted a lot of interest and attention from a lot of historians since the 19th and 20th century, since this was the place where modern capitalism was born, where it existed in its essence, and from where it spread overseas. Now, there was this painter known as whose name was Niels Muller Lund. He was a painter who was born in Denmark, and he took this particular place as his subject for his painting, entitled "The Heart of the Empire." You can actually Google up this painting, or I can provide a link in the description below, as they say in YouTube videos these days. It's like, or maybe I could sort of try and put it into the video too. It'll be much easier if you just Google it up. The name of the painting is Heart of the Empire, and the painter is Niels Muller Lund. Anyway, now if you look at the painting looks down at the Bank Junction, and the vantage point is the roof of Bank of England, and if you look at it, it's gazing out into the older spaces in the city, and you can see the St. Paul's Cathedral and other places. Now, many historians have seen this image as the image of Britain's national identity, and one that is uniquely organized around the business zone of an important urban place, which is the very epicenter of Britain's imperial might. Now, if one were to take only this painting as a single source, and then they may be forgiven if they thought that the landscape determined the city, or rather defined the city as one that was exclusively modern, and that did not have a residential population. It was bereft of a residential population. But on a closer examination, Lund's portrayal actually picks out the cathedrals, the churches, the halls of livery companies. It has a view of Lord Mayor's mansion house. It has the city corporation as one of the ancient local governments of Square Mile, and all of this existing in what is an otherwise dominant financial background. One could then sort of conclude that a place that is celebrated for its modernity also sits side by side with historic sites and buildings. Hence, it's a place that contains the fragments of both the past as well as the essence of the present. And that's just from one painting. Now, another way of challenging the same perception of the city as being that of financial, power and business is by using the approaches developed by historical geographers. What we do is we fix our gaze on the place, and then we focus down on the level, say, of the street, and then we find the workers that sort of serviced its business. And if you do that, then you understand that the city of London is much more than a sum of its economic interests. It becomes a place that contains pockets of overcrowding. It has the working class, housing problems and poverty, and it's a place that's alive. It's alive with the dangers of criminality, and violence. And the perfect example of this is when we take Lund's painting and sort of juxtapose it with another painting of the same period, a painting by Frederick Marley Bell Smith, who was an immigrant to Canada in 1867, and his painting sort of stands in contrast to that of Lund's. In his painting, which is also entitled "The Heart of Empire," was painted in 1909, and Bell Smith has showed how city spaces are much more than just big business. If you look at his painting, again, you can find the painting on the internet. You can Google it up. Frederick Marley Bell Smith, Heart of the Empire. Like I said, I can provide a link in the description below. His painting sort of, if you look at his painting, then it's peopled by ordinary working class Londoners. You can find the newspaper boy, you can find the soldiers, you can find sailors, and you can find this collection of other pedestrians who are going about their daily business. And all of this is happening against sort of the background of financial power. Hence, if you look at it, then the city of modernity and business is certainly one way of looking at a place like London, but it's also a city with spaces that is populated by the poor and powerless. Seeing the place as essentially contested, or any place or space as essentially contested, is one of the major ways in which geographical approaches have been very useful to historians. Because usually with the traditional sort of historical approach, we would see the city limits, we would see the political structures, and perhaps a few things more. But it's only by using geographical approaches to the place that we can begin to see the city's history as existing in several economic and sort of social layers, from the stockbroker to the clerk, to the newspaper boy, to the carriage driver, to the sailor, etc. And by looking at the city's diverse spaces through the lens of historical geography, we can get an alternative view of the city, one that's not dependent on a simple nexus between modernity, business, and empire. Now, the entire idea that I'm trying to argue here is that space and place are not a given. It's not a background, it's not a canvas where time sort of paints its picture on. Places as the city of business, or even the city of the casual poor, are cultural sort of places that are affected by the thoughts and behavior of those who inhabit that place. It's not for nothing. It's said to be something in a city can mean so many different things. I'm sorry, I think you can hear my child screaming in the other room. Anyhow, before going forward, I think it's important to sort of define what is historical geography. It's often said that it's easier to define what the historical geographer does than to sort of define what is historical geography. Uh, as I mentioned before, one could say historical geography is simply the study of places, or rather seeing how a place changes over time. But that, if we sort of, reduce the entire complexity of historical geography to just that one sentence, then it would be doing great injustice to a rather complicated subdiscipline that has a very large and a long, illustrious sort of a legacy and, for lack of a better term, a history. Um, what we can do is sort of see the interconnections between these two disciplines, history and geography, and see how historical geography has evolved in the last 100 years or so. Uh, from the perspective of history, we have the annals school. I haven't taught it yet. I will very soon, but you can of course Google it up, and those of you who are already aware of it will know what I'm saying. The annals school, which developed in France, used geography in historical research, and that was one of its distinctive features. As a matter of fact, Fernand Braudel's work, The Mediterranean World, and in the age of Philip II, is an excellent example how the annals school used geography. Braudel has used climate, terrain, agriculture, cities, trade, transport, and demography before he even got to the people, and discussions on their economy and their history. From the perspective of geography, you have people like William Diller, Matthew Griffith Taylor, Huntington, etc., all arguing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for a global history, that was influenced by geographical factors such as climatic changes. As a matter of fact, Matthew would argue that evolution itself was challenged by climatic variations. Which was in a way a challenge to the concept, to Darwinian concept of evolution, but that's a complicated idea anyway. And you had somebody like Griffith Taylor speaking of a global history that could be seen from the perspective of geography. These ideas sort of set the background to the development of a concept that was known as environmental determinism. That was quite popular in the early half of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, environmental determinism itself originated as a set of ideas that was introduced especially into American geographical thought and practice by Ellen Churchill Semple, which was which is on the basis of a rather selective interpretation of Frederick Ratzel's nature-culture relationship. And in such a relationship, it was argued that environment affects all aspects of social and economic development. And now, though it's treated as a part of geography's distant and sort of shameful past for half a century, you should remember that environmental determinism provided many students of society, and not just geographers, with a theoretical guide for sort of generalizing about the world. The idea of environmental determinism took many variants, and one of them was Griffith Taylor's idea of what he called the stop and go determinism, which was rooted in the conviction that human culture could accelerate, slow, or stop the course in which nature was propelling it, but that direction themselves was sort of geographically determined. You then have the Yale geographer Ellsworth Huntington, who was another who wrote extensively on the role of climate in shaping human history, and as a matter of fact, Matthew Huntington and Taylor argued for human origins from a very political and one might say slightly racial perspective. And it's not without surprise that in the decades that followed, climatic determinism would fall into disrepute. Many of the critiques would insist that its crude fatalism did not give enough role to human agency as a historical force. Scholars identified with what they considered to be empirical evidence that refuted the extravagant claims of what was called the Huntington thesis. Now, even if they were sort of willing to concede that climate and environmental factors acted as restraints on human actions during and immediately after the Second World War. Much of what I mentioned before, the racial, the imperialistic cast of much of the tradition also came under a variety of criticism, which sort of questioned the entire credentials of the environmental determinism thought. For example, somebody like Franz Boas turned from the geographical heritage to cultural anthropology and argued that culture actually had to be seen sui generis, rather as an epiphenomenon of environmental conditions. And by 1940s, the intellectual mood had decisively shifted in his favor. Also, the fact that in technological sort of progress allowed people to think that they could control the environment, rather sort of the other way around. One of the most prominent critiques of environmental determinism was actually the American geographer Carl Sauer. Carl Sauer, who was also known as the father of. I'm so sorry, that's my child. Tickets sorry. Carl Sauer, a prominent geographer from America, argued that environmental determinism did not give was actually a very reductionist and did not give enough role to human agency. And in his paper, Morphology of Landscape, he argued for a non-determinist, cultural geography that had time as its essential component. He conceived of geography as being concerned with facts of a place, which and all these facts in association with one another would give rise to the concept of a landscape. And although he set out as an essentially empirical in his approach to geography, and where he used classification and observation, so did recognize that the way the people perceived and understood landscape was an important aspect of culture. Unfortunately, all of these insights did not develop into a broad sort of historical context of human ideas and beliefs, and Sauer still conceived landscape as a product of cultural processes, and not that of a historical one, historical one that could incorporate human values and ideas. For Sawyer, the study of changing landscape continued to be the essence of historical geography. And though he accepted that time was an integral process of human geography, Sawyer had unfortunately a very poor concept of history. He had very little to say about history, apart from pointing out that human geography was not concerned with individuals, but rather with institutions and culture. Now, the idea of progress that was central to Sawyer's ideas or Sawyer's concept of historical geography actually owed more to natural science than it did to the idea of history. And this I would want you all to remember, the concept of natural science, or rather the concept of natural history, as opposed to an idea of history, which will become important in the sections to follow. The other person who would carry forward these ideas, or rather, would form one of the three who would later be known as the fathers of historical geography, was Sir Henry Clifford. And in his paper describing the relations between geography and history, Darby used the analogy of a motion picture to sort of show how change worked in geography. He interestingly wrote that the landscape was not a static arrangement of objects. It has become what it is, and it is usually in the process of becoming something different. As a matter of fact, the analogy he used, if one could sort of adapt it to modern, more contemporary perspective, is that of watching a movie on your laptop. Imagine watching a movie on your laptop, and imagine hitting the pause button right in the middle of the movie, and you have a frozen screen, right? Uh, now try understanding the entire movie from that particular frozen screen. I mean, you can't, can you? You need to understand what has happened before that scene and what will happen after that scene. And this was exactly the position that led sort of Darby to his conclusion about the relations between geography and history. He argued that the geography of the present day, was but a thin layer that even at the moment was becoming history. Um, if one could, it's like watching that movie. That one that scene is just part of a million, millions of other scenes that go on to constitute the entire movie. So hence, he argued, is it possible then to draw a line between geography and history? And for him, the answer was no. For him, all geography was historical geography, whether it was actual or potential. Now, Darby conceptualized history as being the same as change and past. He argued very, eloquently that let's not study a static picture, but rather a process that is continually and seemingly never ending. Now, in a chapter, the third person who went on to become very important in the growth of historical geography was a geographer known as Andrew Clark. And in his chapter on historical geography, he sought to develop a case for the subdiscipline as a field of research. He mentioned that historical geography was defined as a focus of interest on past geographies, especially what may be termed as geographical change through time. Clark would sort of, elaborate on his idea by pointing out that the conditions observed at any period of time can only be understood as momentary states in a continuing and a complex process of change. It's the same idea that Darby had used earlier, and one that I explained using the analogy of watching a movie in your laptop. That trying to understand the geography without understanding that it's part of a process, part of a larger process, like trying to understand a movie from the still that is frozen on your laptop screen. That screen is just part of the larger process. In other words, you had to understand historical geography as a process, not something that you can pluck out of time, a space or even a place that can be plucked out of time and just studied, by itself. Uh, he argued that the genetic approach would focus on the processes, because whatever interested us in the contemporary scene could only be understood in terms of processes at work that went on to produce it. And the range of topics that were open to the historical geographical study would include all branches of geography, whether it was cultural, physical, biotic, because any study of past geography, any kind of study of past geography or geographical change through time was historical geography. Now, these ideas sort of were applied as the criterion for assessing the contribution of any historical geography, contribution to historical geography of any study, which for Clark was to judge its relevance to the reconstruction of past geographies and to the interpretation of geographical change through time. And in developing the concept of historical geography, Clark used past and time as synonymous for history, just as Darby had done before him, just as Sawyer had done before that. He wrote that history here meant the discipline that was concerned with human society in its various facets. The character of change was through time, and the ideas or the circumstances, including natural ones, were those that influenced these changes. And if you take this definition of history, then it seems that it's giving a lot of sort of credence to human agency, but and also looking at the concept of history as an idea. But unfortunately, that was not the philosophical view of history that sort of he incorporated into a study of historical geography. Uh, you know, the fourth person that we can take is one who is more recent than the earlier three that we had discussed, and he was Donald Mining. Uh, Donald Mining became one of the leading exponent of historical geography as a study of regional patterns and change, and he used historical geography to colonial America, and where he defined that one of the most important tasks of historical geography, especially in the period of colonial America, was to define as clearly as possible the sequence of territorial formation, from points to nuclei to regions on the North American seaboard, and to describe the changing geography in terms of spatial systems, cultural landscape, and social geography. Mining was more concerned with the ways geographical areas were constructed in the social and cultural context, uh, which included the study of geographical change as a vital component of especially of his historical geographical analysis. As such, his idea of historical geography sort of puts him strongly in the tradition of Sawyer, Clarke, and Darby. Now, the, what I had mentioned before, that all three of them took history as being synonymous for time and change, but one of the most important factors was that they took history as being a natural history. And that strong natural history tradition of historical geography that was established in the works of Sawyer, Darby, Clarke, and Mining was to have a profound impact on this subfield. And even though in the recent years there's been sort of a stronger awareness of philosophy by geographers, that natural history perspective is still strongly there. Of course, as you would find out in the discussions below, that there has been a questioning of the landscape emphasis, and there have been a variety of suggestions that have been made for strengthening the human component in historical geography, and of course also for various suggestions for dealing with the idea of markers of landscape, and symbolic meanings of these markers and that of the landscape. But historical geography still takes natural history as being one of being the kind of history that it wants to look into. Unfortunately, if you take natural history as the only kind of history that historical geography would sort of consider, then that is not suited to the kind of ecological landscapes, the ecological landscape studies where human activity exists, both in its physical or biological sort of expression on the landscape. And that position becomes more and more difficult and less satisfactory when one sort of tries to deal with the intellectual dimension of human activity. That task actually becomes of converting an external description of process and change into an sort of an explication of internal logic of human agents themselves. And in such a case, natural history idea of historical geography does not provide a basis in which to write a coherent historical geography. Now, having defined how historical geography came, how we challenged the idea of environmental determinism, now we move into the second half of the 20th century. And here in the 1960s, you had a quantitative revolution in geography itself, and historical geography was unfortunately marginalized. Now, that is actually quite surprising, because one of the major criticism of traditional historical geography was that it was positivist and empirical. It was not just it was strongly tied to archival data. It was strongly tied to field observation, and it was criticized for only producing reconstruction of past patterns. It was strongly criticized for not investigating the processes behind the patterns and just evaluating data, without the cultural and political context. In that way, it should have fit with the positivist sort of revolution. The problem really was the fact that historical geography's approach was theoretical, in the sense that it did not have a strong positivist spatial theory and a scientific mode of hypothesis testing. As a matter of fact, not many historical geographers were even quick to adapt to computerized techniques to handle large data sets. It's quite surprising that Darby, who was famous for his doomsday work, did not undertake the computerization of doomsday report. It actually fell on a historian to do it, surprisingly. However, during this period, you also see a rise of a large number of urban historical geographers who actually used traditional historical sources such as Paris registers and 19th century enumerators, books from the census, and while linking all of these to an urban ecological theory through the technique of factorial ecology. And a lot of adventurous researches were made with these sort of computerized data sets. And there was also a very innovative attempt to simulate missing data in the records of the medieval and the early modern agricultural periods, and to see the innovations and its productivities. One of the persons who was the most fervent advocates of historical, what could be termed as historical quantitative spatial analysis, was actually the Canadian geographer William Norton, for whom historical geography, and this is very important, for whom historical geography was actually the study of spatial form evolution, which focused on the relationship between process and form, and whose used methodologies such as computer simulations and counterfactual analysis and etc. And one of the reasons why William Norton was able to do this was because his mentors were actually the mathematician turned geographer Alan Wilson and the new economic historian Robert Fogel. Rather than the traditional founding fathers that I've defined above, the Henry Clifford Darby's, the Carl Sowers and Andrew Clark's, so on and so forth. In the 1970s, however, that positivist geographical approach itself would come under a variety of alternative, would come under challenges by a variety of alternative approaches, especially those which had a very strong Marxist leanings. As a matter of fact, if you look at it, American historical geographers, or even historical geographers in general, would still express a sense of isolation in an unfriendly world of remote sensings and geographical information systems, and questions of relevance that was of relevance, questions of relevant research that only looked at the immediate needs of policymakers, etc. As a matter of fact, Mitchell has observed that historical geographers have acquired a status that is actually quite marginal to the contemporary scientific and historical character of geography. Now, historical geographers have recently approached the questions of cultural transfer, immigration, and frontier settlements in new and exciting ways. One could look at the work of Robert Oestringen's study of the Swedish migration to Minnesota, which includes a comparison of origins and comparisons of origins and destination communities, as well as a discussion on the secondary destination, in different environmental conditions. And you have somebody like Robert Sauder, who's sort of concentrating on the different appraisals of land made by surveyors, settlers, in the arid intermountain West. You have somebody like Mitchell and Newton offering contrasting perspectives in the Pelagian frontier. Then you have Jordan and Cobbs who controversially has linked the cultural traits of upland south to the combination of Finnish and indigenous woodland influences, which actually led to a successful forest colonization, basically looking at culture from the perspective of these mixing of two different groups, which then leads to the question of what kind of contact is necessary for transmission of such skills and techniques, and even of belief systems, and social structures between two different groups when they are sort of brought together. Apart from these works, some really interesting historical geographical seminars and publications actually coming out of Israel. And if you look at some of the topics of their, or rather the topics and titles of their conferences and papers, then you would understand why it's so. For example, some of them are entitled as Land That Became Israel, the other as Ideology and Landscape, where they are engaging in discussions on placemaking, cultural politics, iconography, and reading of landscapes, etc. And you would understand, considering the kind of political and strategic problems that exists in that part of the Middle East, why such questions would come into play, which also brings in the question, is this discipline entirely free from political consideration? The answer is probably no. Anyhow, in such an approach, the landscape sort of becomes a text subject, in the same way that a particular article that I shared with you all, Signs of Wali, how it defines our landscape, becomes a text subject. In the same way, this approach treats landscape as a text subject, and it's interesting that the role models for cultural and historical geographers here are actually literary and artistic critics, like people like Raymond Williams and John Barrell. And these kind of approaches from other disciplines have actually led to a very interesting sort of an interdisciplinary approach for cultural and historical geography in this part of the world. In what can be defined as the new cultural geography, you have the works of people like Dennis Cosgrove, you have Peter Jackson, you have Nigel Thrift, all of them looking at the past and present. And then you have some economic geographers like Doran Massey, David Hardy, all of them also looking at past processes, etc. And then you have the feminist geographers who are also doing the same. So you see, going beyond sort of these kind of labels of cultural, economic, social, a lot of them actually practicing historical geography. As a matter of fact, Gillian Rose and Miles Ogburn have been very critical of historical geography for continuously neglecting women. It's a fascinating sort of an approach. They have argued that women are hidden from geography, just as they were once hidden from history. Jean Kay also makes a similar point, noting that even though there's a growth of women's history, that is actually not matched by a geographical study of the experience of women or the influence in making of landscapes. And of course, there has been some attention paid to the role of women in regional economies, whether it is in textile factories in Lancashire or Yorkshire, or whether it is domestic servants coming in from rural districts to mainly middle class urban suburbs, spas, market towns. One can also draw an analogy with contemporary things happening in the Himalayan region, and lack of work in certain industries for women, such as steel and coal mining areas, or the excess representation of women in certain industries, such as the tea gardens, etc. But these researchers has not been informed, or rather has not taken into account feminist theories. Interestingly, Rose and Ogburn has outlined an agenda for what can be defined as a feminist historical geographers. They argue that the interconnection between gender relations, place and landscape, that is predicated upon a concept of patriarchy and is investigative of the relations between patriarchy and capitalism should be done. They, as a matter of fact, suggest 3 areas for research. The first being the importance of space in structuring the social relations of gender. that is, considering how different spaces, are associated with men uh, and women, and how the space is used to control their lives, whether it is institutionally by segregation of women and men, in different wings. And you want to think of how it was done in school, in colleges, whether it is, in temples, or whether it is done in different sort of institutions, having different line for men and women, or in hospitals and asylums and ashrams and so on and so forth, or even domestically, in how there's designation of gendered species within home. One could think of how women in Western Nepal are segregated during their menstruation period, while they're having their menstruation, and you'd understand what sort of this suggestion was all about. Then there is an argument for looking at the spatial variations in the form of patriarchy, which then connects with another major sort of theme of human geography, which is the importance of locality, which will come to it later. And finally, the suggestion was that to look at the role of gender in the cultural construction of landscape, especially in the realm of iconography. Now, how does now if you remember, when I started this, started the process of describing historical geography, I had spoken of people like Henry Clifford Darby, I had spoken of Carl Sauer, of Andrew Clark, and Donald Mining. Of course, there are many, and their concept of historical geography seemed to be very different from what I just mentioned about people like Gillian Rose and Miles Ogburn and Jean Kay, etc. Now, how does people who follow sort of that traditional historical geography feel about these sort of new ideas? And one could say that mainstream historical geography is still not very comfortable with these questions of gender and landscape, and looking at patriarchy and capitalism informing of landscapes. But one could also argue that's the case with every discipline. Now you have historians who are not very comfortable with gender history, feminist historiography, etc. And same is the case with historical geography. As a matter of fact, if you look at America, then you have people like Audrey Kobayashi, Suzanne McKenzie, Damaris Rose, who still haven't achieved the same status among historical geographers, who are still sort of stuck in the reconstruction of past landscape. Speaking of America, the links between historical and sort of the contemporary human geography is maintained by the integration, the tradition of cultural geography that was established by the person I had mentioned before, Carl Sawyer. Here, the past and the present are sort of united through an interest in relict features, architecture, artifacts that have survived from the past into the present landscape. And you can think of even your own sort of town and think of what I mean here, try and understand what I mean here. But there is sort of a failure to connect with contemporary social and economic reasons, and these are basically because of things that are very central to Saw's methodology, which is the fact that it is very non-theoretical, and has a lot of emphasis on the material, and focuses on the cultural processes and artifacts, and usually neglects the values and habits that actually lead to these cultural practices and artifacts, development of artifacts. Be that as it may, landscape historical geographers are becoming more sensitive to political and social issue, and one only needs to think of Cosgrove's famous dictum that landscape is a construction, it is a composition, a way of seeing the world, and that is, it's very familiar with the ideas of landscape history. There is a fear, and perhaps a justifiable one, in that the historical geographer's research is a bit too closely linked with the needs of the present, such as sort of justifying the critiques of privatization by linking it with the inadequacies of laissez-faire, or sort of cultivating pride in the heroic interpretations of the past, or sort of supporting schemes for heritage conservation, or even less ideologically, simply applying fashionable sort of theories to test their validity in the past landscapes, etc. But the problem is, if we accept that history is the reinterpretation of the past in the light of the present, which is, there in the famous dictum that all history is history of today, then it is difficult to see how it could be otherwise. Though you have attempts by people like the Canadian geographer Leonard Gulke, and if you remember, I have shared one article by him, which is to promote a more idealist approach in historical geography by defining the history of thoughts relating to, defining the subject as the history of thoughts relating to human activity on land, and seeking to sort of rethink the thoughts of the colonists, and whose sort of patterns of settlement provides Gulke with the starting point for his research. Unfortunately, these have not led to the development of a methodology. It could also be argued that to expect geographers to understand that the contemporaries' perceptions and ways of thinking are actually very relevant into understanding the actions is perhaps a step too great. One rarely sees that with history. To see it with geography is perhaps expecting a bit too much. But then you do have works like David Ward, who has been examining the changing conceptions of the slum and the ghetto in American cities from the 1840 to 1925, and he's been contrasting successive sort of phases of interpretation by the 19th and early 20th century observers with the more recent ecological structural reinterpretation. And David Harvey has also been stressing at the experiences and the consciousness of urbanization among the residents of Second Empire Paris, but only as one element in what can be said as an impressive sort of structural interpretation of the urbanization process. Having said all of these, it also remains that the application of all these new approaches have actually been quite limited. Now, Robin Button has noted that there are actually very few applications of the Marxist methods in historical geographical research, and the exceptions being the works by David Harvey, Michael Dunford, Diana Perrons, especially in their work Arena Capital, that looks at the change in the structure of British space economy, that ranging from the Doomsday right up to 1945, and all the way from sort of feudalism and what can be defined as Fordism. And if you look at their works, David Harvey actually has very little time, or gives very little time to empiricism, especially of atheoretical urban historical geographers. And even Michael Dunford and Diana Perron actually prefers to draw on the works of Marxist historians like Hobsbawm, rather than looking at other non-Marxist geographers. Even though Daniel Dunford and Michael Perron both have admitted that they have not given enough questions to human agencies. There are other geographers who have actually employed Anthony Giddens' theory of structuration in an attempt to reconcile Marxist structuralism with sort of the humanist concern for individual human agency. One of the more illustrious example of the structurationist approach is actually by the works of Derek Gregory, whose book I've also shared with you all, which discusses the regional transformation and class struggle in the late 18th and early 19th century, especially in the West Riding textile industry. There is work by Alan R.H. Baker on cooperatives, fertile societies, and cultural institutions in rural France, and then there's the work by Alan Richard Pred, who's been looking at mercantile urban development in eastern United States and the rural settlements in Sweden, which sort of integrate the experiences and everyday sort of activity patterns of people like the merchants and farmers within the structural context. If an example can be given of studying of enclosures by Pred and how it becomes a place especially in villages of Sweden. And then you see how the reflexiveness of dominant projects being enclosures, commercializations, and the daily and life patterns of individuals. Stuff like the decline of cooperatives, cooperative agriculture, the growth of individualism, and how these things are reflected in the routine practices. Uh, it should also be remembered that Pred borrows a lot from Torsten Hagerstand's Time Geography and Fernand Brauddel's Historia Total. And equally influential has also been Foucault's ideas on geography, especially of power, discipline, and punishment, which have actually led to the publications of several research papers on the micro geography of institutions, uh, especially especially those on the concept of mental illness and organization and location of asylums, etc. Now, in almost every case, one notices that the emphasis has been on the local. There is a lot of credence given to locality studies, which is argued that the universal structures and processes, outcomes, sort of are widely can be seen from a particular mix of local circumstances and historical context. Uh, hence, if you look at the industrial restructuring, the technological change, the transition from Fordism to flexible accumulation, and the impact of patriarchy, they have different impacts in different localities, which all which then depends on, and as I mentioned before, on a variety of local circumstances and its own historical sort of context. Uh, in Britain, for example, you have the economic and social research, which have sponsored a variety of locality studies. So hence you have David Smith, who's compared the operation of paternalist strategies in the towns of Pullman outside Chicago, and Bournville and the suburbs of Birmingham. You have Nigel Thrift, who has contrasted class formation in 19th century Sheffield. You have Richard Harris, who's examined recent historical protests